What's up, my comic comrades? Hope you all are doing great. For those of you who don't follow us on social media, we actually just got back from a 3-day visit to Walt Disney World in Orlando, Florida, where Disney invited us to check out the brand new Rise of the Resistance attraction inside Galaxy's Edge at Disney's Hollywood Studios. Rise of the Resistance is one of the coolest things we've ever experienced, but the entire world of Batuu, also called Black Spire Outpost, is also so incredibly immersive. I mean, we built lightsabers, we saw flying X-Wings, and of course, the full-scale Millennium Falcon. Not to mention, you can't beat Disney during the holidays. It was incredible, and you could follow our visit on the Variant Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. But we also will be posting a full video of our experience here on the channel tomorrow afternoon, so keep an eye out for that. But for today's episode, we have partnered with our good friends Comic Tom and Jeff, the Golden Age Guru, to bring you guys a complete history of the Golden Age of comics. We've actually been looking forward to this one for quite a while now, so without further ado, let's dive into the birth of superhero comics.
Variant Nation, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm your host, Comic Tom. I am a comic book collector. I'm a friend of Arris and a fan of Variant and a part of the Variant Nation. And I'm sitting here with my friend, longtime friend, Jeff.
What's going on, guys? I'm Jeff, the Golden Age Guru. I'm here to help you sort out through some of this Golden Age confusion. I mean, we're talking a long time ago. We're talking 1938 to 1955.
That's right. We're diving right into the history of the Golden Age. And we're going to kick this off in 1938, June, with the $130 hero.
Yeah, you're not kidding. The $130 hero is right. We have the two creators, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, who for 5 years tried to sell a character to probably every single comic book publisher out there.
Yeah, they had a hard time doing it.
And they couldn't. And it wasn't until an editor from DC, Vin Sullivan, who was the managing editor at the time, needed a new adventure story. So where did they go? They went and looked in the rejection bin of submissions that they got.
Yeah, it almost didn't happen.
He loved it, and he wanted to put it on the very first issue of Action Comics #1. And this character we're talking about is none other than who?
Superman, the first superhero.
Who was purchased for $130. Now, we actually have a picture of the check. It's for $412 that they received. You can see itemized on that check that it says Superman, $130, and then some pages that they did that they're getting money for.
Now, with the major success of this title, you would think it was clear that Superman was the reason these comics were selling, but it wasn't until issue number 7 of Action Comics that he would appear on the title again. I'm actually sitting in front of one right now, and notice that Superman is actually leaping because he didn't fly yet. He wouldn't fly until way later in issue 65.
We're talking 1943 here, Tom. This is 5 years after his first appearance. To see a superhero fly for the very first time, we're going to look just the following year in 1939 with a character most of us all know, the Submariner.
Yeah, this comic book was given away at theaters. Very low print count, very rare book.
Yeah, this was titled Motion Picture Funnies Weekly. And this is the first published appearance we have of Submariner, who not only could he fly and be the first superhero to do that, he was also the first anti-hero.
It was a race to the newsstands. Publishers couldn't get there fast enough, and by May 1939, we see the introduction of the Dark Knight, the Batman.
You were not joking when you said race to the newsstand. In 1938, there was only about 200 titles. By 1940, we had over 600 titles. Detective Comics 27 brought a much darker character with Batman. Superman was obviously this heroic character, but very goody two-shoe. Batman was the complete opposite. Far darker, he had a gun, he killed people.
Yeah, you had to think for snapping necks. The creators, Bill Finger and Bob Kane, they weren't afraid of writing and creating a dark and aggressive hero.
If we're going to discuss an aggressive character, let's talk about the Human Torch, who came out later this year in 1939. He donned the pages of Timely, which was the precursor to Marvel, their very first comic called Marvel Comics 1.
He was an android. He flew around. And this also is a low-key integration of science fiction into a superhero title. They were trying new things.
This blockbuster issue also had Submariner in the pages of this book.
Now, during this 2 years of comic book creation, publishers couldn't find artists fast enough. They were farming them from other companies. You brought such a cool cover here, Submariner 11. He's saving a woman in a dragon's mouth.
That is easily one of my favorite covers in that entire run.
As you can see, we love collecting comic books. We talk about them a lot, and we make them on our YouTube channel at Comic Tom 101.
I want to continue with some more of this great information because we're now kicking it into 1940. And to start off that year, we have the first appearance of our Crimson Speedster, the Flash, in Flash Comics #1.
Yeah, big thanks to Gardner Fox for creating the Golden Age Flash, Jay Garrick, and the very next month, groundbreaking, we have the introduction of the first major competition to Superman.
Competition would be an understatement because by the mid-40s, this hero outsold Superman, and probably even a couple years prior. We're talking about Shazam, as this generation knows, but in the Golden Age, Captain Marvel was his name. Billy Batson, the younger persona of Captain Marvel, was crushing on the newsstand.
Would meet a whole new demographic of young readers combining humor and superhero storytelling.
They were more able to associate themselves in the pages of a comic now with a kid, and we get to see that transition into Detective Comics 38.
Competition being an understatement. Talk about relatability being an understatement. 9 out of 10 kids read comics, boys and girls, in the 1940s, which led in just a quick 2 months in Detective Comics 38, the first appearance of a very relatable character, the sidekick. For the first time, we have Batman and Robin on the cover.
This is a big moment because now that will lead to future sidekicks. What's more important is that we should be happy with the name Robin.
That's right. What were some of the other options on the table?
Some of the names that were kicking around were freaking ridiculous. I'll be honest with you, because we had names just for a few. We had Wildcat, we had Davy, and we had Sacco.
Yeah, we could be very grateful they didn't go with Batman and Sacco the Boy Wonder. But this year had some other momentous occasions. We had characters starting to cross over to different titles like Submariner and the Human Torch. And we're talking about superheroes this whole time. What about the supervillains?
Yeah, in this year of 1940, we got to see 2 mega villains that we're all going to be familiar with. We have Lex Luthor in Action Comics 23, and then we have the billion-dollar villain, Joker, who first appears in Batman 1.
All this stuff was brand new to the public. They were eating it up. And by the end of this year, we would see what publishers would do with their characters in reserves who didn't get solo titles. They would put them all together and make up the first superhero team in All-Star Comics issue #3 with the JSA, the Justice Society of America.
Now, we saw the birth of the Golden Age in 1938, but that was also the start of the war overseas. Now, by 1941, we're going to join this war. And we see that same year the most patriotic character in all of comics, Captain America Comics #1, hits the newsstand. And more than any other way, we see this huge image of Captain America jumping into scene and punching Hitler across the face.
America was extremely patriotic at this time, so it would be a no-brainer for Joe Simon and Jack Kirby to go on to create a symbol of patriotism and freedom. Captain America 1 would have a 95% sellout rate. People loved Cap.
We saw every subsequent issue after that sell over 1 million issues. And this is why I have issue #2, because I love this book. It's actually the first appearance of the round shield, because he didn't start off with the round shield. Even though it's not noted by CGC, that is it, which is so epic and such a symbol for this character.
Yeah, it's really interesting. But I'm curious, why did you have Stan Lee sign your copy of Cap 2? Stan wouldn't actually write his first comic story until Cap 3.
Yeah, I don't really want to get into that story. We'll have to save that for another time, but I do want to tell you that #3 has an epic Red Skull cover.
And in December, we would also have the introduction of the 80-year-old redhead.
You're talking about the grandfather of teen humor here. We're talking about Archie. Pep Comics 22 is his very first appearance, MLJ Publications. This came out in December of 1941. And that was a really dark day for America because we had the bombing of Pearl Harbor, which sent us directly to World War II the very next day.
We had the introduction of characters like Wonder Woman in All-Star Comics 8. Characters that were brought to the forefront to empower women and individuals during a very difficult time in American history.
As you mentioned, this is going to be a really dark time, and we got to see through entering the war that it's going to now become endless story arcs for our superheroes, because we got to see a strong presence of war in all these comics, and it was something that the country really relied on and needed for support to see heroes fighting villains and horrible horrors across the world.
And this isn't just civilians. Military personnel were consuming comic books as well. Let's tell them about that National Comics right there.
Before I get too heavy into National Comics 18, I have to tell you, 1 out of 4 magazines shipped overseas was a comic book, and that went to a military base, which was then distributed to soldiers. But when it was distributed to soldiers, it received a star stamp on the cover. So this comic came out 1 month before Pearl Harbor, and in its pages has Pearl Harbor bombed.
What a crazy historical coincidence.
Historically, obviously, this book's pretty dang freaking amazing, but it does have that stamp. So for me, as a collector, that adds something super special. So I had to grab this book the second I saw it.
Post-World War II, in the mid-40s, service members were coming back home, and they were not as interested in superheroes going to war.
This was a really dynamic time in comics. We had to see the evolution from superheroes to some new things to hit the newsstands because now there needed to be more variety. They weren't into just superheroes fighting war anymore. Crime became extremely popular, and so did romance, horror. We had a rebirth and a revitalization in comics on different levels.
Yeah, some collectors actually separate this era and call it the Atomic Age. And we also had a society of people consuming Westerns just on a crazy amount because they're on TV. And pretty much every major Western star had their own photo cover at some point.
Yeah, we got to see Roy Rogers, Gene Autry, Tex Ritter, you name them. They had a comic book.
But the real fascinating thing here is the competition among publishers, getting seen on the stands. Who could outdo one another? And it is here where we see creativity at its max. Artists were going wild.
One particular genre that I want to single out is romance. And you might think romance is silly, whatnot, but I have to tell you that the artist who could draw the female figure better than anybody ever in comics, in my opinion, was Matt Baker.
We have science fiction at an all-time max. L.B. Cole blowing people's minds with his color work. Frank Frazetta drawing tentacles and science fiction covers like no other.
In the mid-40s, we had 1,400 titles. Okay, we're approaching here to the early 50s where we would see 2,800 titles of comics. Now, with horror and crime being the leading sellers on those stands, you have to think there has to be competition. And the only way to really cut through that competition is with drama. Severe crime and severe horror were selling.
That's right. And this is where things come to a head. Everything in the Golden Age comes to this point because what we're seeing on the stands was largely not appropriate for children, which a lot of these comic books were marketed to.
Crime and horror were the driving force for comics at that point, but they would also ultimately be its demise. They were over the top, in my opinion. You have Fight Against Crime 20. I mean, a guy dumping a body into a sewer of a decapitated female character. All right, there were a lot of decapitations. Crime Suspense Stories 22, same thing, decapitation cover. We had shrunken head covers. We had eye poker covers. Mr. Mystery 12, exploding faces and melting faces. Black Cat 50. I mean, these were all over the newsstands for years.
These covers were extreme, but the response to them was just as extreme. There was a growing disdain for comic books. And what it did was ban a lot of people in different sectors together to try and get rid of them across the country.
1954 was a huge year, and in a negative way for comic books. We had a Dr. Frederick Wertham, a psychologist, very famous psychologist at the time. He wrote a book called Seduction of the Innocent. This book described in length about comics and how they were perverting the minds of children. So this was a big deal. We already had the underbelly and watching comics being burned at schools and churches. And so now there's more fuel to this fire.
Although the evidence used in the book was largely unscientific, the effects were grand and would take comics into court.
This was interesting because the entire comic industry was now brought into a legal battle. And we had to have a code ultimately that's going to protect the children, because due to the publisher's actions, now we have to have strict guidelines of what can be published and what's safe to be read
and put on the stands. And at this point, the rules that were put in place all but banned anything that could be looked at as slightly controversial.
Ultimately, this became the demise of the Golden Age. We had doors shutting for publishers left and right. We saw over 2,600 titles in 1954 in the newsstand. I mean, that's over 1,000 more than in the mid-40s. So comics had grown, but this moment had crushed them.
It would take years for a revitalization in comics to come, but when it does hit, it lands hard in the form of the next era of comic books. But that conversation is for another day. Thanks, Variant Nation. We do appreciate your time today, and geek responsibly.
That's right, unless you're a professional, always geek with proper supervision. Anyway, this was freaking awesome. If you're a comic book fan on any level, it's always important to understand where the art form came from and how it has evolved. So we want to offer a huge thank you to Comic Tom and Jeff, the Golden Age Guru, for bringing the knowledge. You've heard us talk about these guys on the show many times, and we've done several epic comic book giveaways with them this past year. As you can see, they're a great resource for comic book and collector knowledge, so you should definitely be following them. We've placed links to the Comic Tom 101 YouTube channel, as well as where to follow them on social media, in the description below. We're also already talking about making this a series that covers every age in comics chronologically. So if you like this episode and would like to see that happen, be sure to let us know in the comments. But also, make sure to like and share this episode. But that's gonna bring this episode to a close. If you like this video, be sure to check out this one right here, and be sure to like and subscribe, it helps out the channel. But I'll see you guys next time when I talk about all things comics.